Hello and good afternoon and welcome to our webinar. So my name is Simon Corbey. I'm qualified as a chartered surveyor back in 1993. So that means it's over 30 years now, which is slightly sobering. So welcome to our webinar, which is called Deconstruction, the cornerstone of circularity. And I'm joined today by a fantastic panel. So we've got four experts to join and to talk us through the various issues that we're facing to try and encourage and mainstream deconstruction and reuse. So what I'm going to do is to go through the panel and to ask them to introduce themselves and to turn their camera on. So I'm joined today by two fantastic colleagues from ASBP, and we are a sustainability organisation, not-for-profit. And so first of all, I'd like to introduce our technical director, and that's Dr. Catherine Adams. So hello, Catherine, thanks for joining us.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming along to listen to us. Hi, Simon. Yes, so I'm Catherine Adams. As Simon says, I work for Alliance for Sustainable Building Products, and I also have my own company, Reusefully. I've been looking at construction demolition waste for a good, I think nearly 25 years now, so a long old time. So hopefully share a bit of what I've learned in that time. Thank you.
Thanks, Catherine. So Catherine brings a wealth of experience. She also pretty much knows everybody. So she probably knows everybody on this call. So now I'd like to introduce my fellow director. So this is Debbie Ward. She's Circular Economy and Reuse Director at the ASBP. So Debbie, perhaps you can say a few words about yourself and who you are.
Yep, good afternoon, Simon, and hello everybody on the webinar. Yeah, my name's Debbie Ward. I'm a director for the ASBP. I've been with the ASBP for a couple of years now, leading on the Reuse Now campaign, which I'll tell you a little bit more about shortly. I'm also a director for Rebuild, which is a construction materials reuse hub.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Debbie. Yeah, so I look forward to your contributions. And we're also joined this afternoon by sort of two ends of the value chain. So I'd like to introduce, first of all, Henry Robinson. So he is Ecosystems Development Director at the Francis Crick Institute, and also director of a new company called Ampersand, which is a creative development company. So Henry, welcome to the webinar. Perhaps you can say a few words about yourself.
Hi, yes, thanks, Simon. So yes, I guess I'm here to represent the client side and the decisions we make in the whole value chain, and hopefully give some insight. So yes, as the ecosystem development director for the Crick, I can share some experiences we have with working with our partners, Reef and BlackRock, in our expansion of the Crick, as well as with British Land. And then I'll share some of my experience as a developer with my colleagues here at Ampersand, which had come out of Derwent, London. So sharing some of the experience where we've worked with Catherine and her team on some of the buildings that I've done. So,
just goes to show that everybody knows Catherine. So, yeah, all right. Thank you, Henry. Yeah, I look forward to your very valuable contributions. And then and I'd like to introduce now Daniel Sweeney. So Daniel is Head of Sustainability at John F. Hunt Group. So John F. Hunt are patron members with ASBP, and Daniel has a wealth of experience working in this area. So perhaps you can say a few words, Daniel.
Yeah, thanks, Simon. For those who don't know, John F. Hunt, we're sort of an enabling works and I guess demolition / deconstruction contractor. Main part of our business is in that central London, those inner city boroughs, the commercial space. So reuse and deconstruction is quite high on what we do at the moment. So I've been living and breathing the circular economy for the past 4 or 5 years, quite specifically. So thanks.
Yeah, fantastic, Daniel. So just a quick reminder to everybody. So thanks once again for joining us. So we are recording this webinar. It will be available on the WBEF website in a week or so. And we also will be doing a write-up of the event too. So that'll come into your inbox. So we'll be covering all bases and making sure that you've got everything that you need. So just by way of an introduction, I'm just going to pass on to my colleague Debbie, who's going to give a very, very brief overview about ASBP and a quick word on our Reuse Now campaign. So over to you, Debbie.
Thanks, Simon. Yeah, quick whistle stop because we've got lots to pack in today, but we really wanted to give you a bit of an overview of what the Alliance for Sustainable Building Products is about. As Simon mentioned, we're a not-for-profit mission-led sustainability organisation. Our mission is to work with our members and the wider construction industry to create a healthy, low-carbon built environment. We do lots of different work to help achieve that goal, including sharing learning through events, leading on research projects, creating best practice guidance, fostering collaboration, influencing policy and doing advocacy work. And it really spreads across lots of different areas, not just resource efficiency and circular economy, but also health and well-being, which is something that Simon's particularly close to, but also technical performance, ethics, transparency and social value. On the technical performance side, we have groups such as the Healthy Paints and Finishes group and the Natural Fibre Insulation group. And we've recently done a lot of work into the reuse of structural steel with our Disrupt 1 and Disrupt 2 projects. I think I can say, up to a couple of years ago, I was aware of the ASBP, but till I actually got involved with the team and really understood more around what they do, I didn't realise the depth of the work and the resources that are available. So I really encourage everybody to have a look at the website because most of it is free to access. Just a quick overview of the Reuse Now campaign. It does what it says on the tin, really. We focus very much around the reuse of construction materials. We've got a really practical focus. We don't want to reinvent the wheel. Very much about dot joining and signposting to what's already there, and really then trying to work with our members in the wider construction industry to see what the gaps are, to very practically fill in those gaps of knowledge and research. And one of the things that we did recently was a bit of a deep dive on the reuse of glass partitioning systems, and that report is on the website, as is a lunch and learn webinar. So yeah, lots of different activities, lots of different engagement. We'd really love to tell you more about it. If you want to engage with us, please take a look at the website.
Thanks, Debbie. And then just to mention, we do lots of physical events. So Debbie's in Manchester tomorrow with Catherine for an insightful event in person. So have a look at our website. And if you're in that Manchester area and you're free, we'd be delighted to see you. All right, so we've got a few questions to go through. We've got sort of 7 broad questions that we've created to sort of talk through. So maybe we can move on to the first question. So our first question is, how widely are the processes and practices supporting deconstruction and material reuse being adopted in the building life cycle? I think perhaps I'm going to start off by going to Henry here, because in my humble opinion, it really is the client that drives this or not, as the case may be. And I'm not sure, Henry, if that chimes with your thinking, and I'm just curious to know what your approach would be here.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, it is in my time at Derwent London and working with Catherine and her team, it very much is central to, if you even look at Derwent's publications, it's central to how we look at each asset. So, I'll take an example of 50 Baker Street, which we recently got planning permission for a full redevelopment. There was a huge amount of study that went into that building and understanding what reuse of the existing buildings could mean as a first step. Always think of reuse first, but then look at what it is that you could reuse on site, but then taking the time and yes, it is more expensive, but taking the time to really understand what this bank of material can provide. And Derwent London is also pretty good at looking at its own existing assets. Of course, this was a joint venture. And this is an attitude that we at Ampersand also has across all the developments we look at. And I think the trick to this is, to really reflect, to really spend the time early on, and looking what buildings can be sensibly reused and repositioned for continual future use. Coming back to 50 Baker Street, we ended up getting a solution where we actually sliced up the concrete of one of the existing buildings and use it as void formers within the new raft foundation, which saved a huge amount of carbon, and also looked at the reuse of the materials, maybe not on site but off site, but always try to focus on using materials on site. Just moving on to my role at the Crick, and working with partners, Reef. There we looked at what's the resources you have available, and we used this, I'll skip the right word, but it's called the Tribeca brick. So we used the clay that we excavated from the site to create this very low carbon brick from the site to create the walls for the basements. Now, the other thing I would say is the key thing for developers to consider, what I would always look at, is to be really realistic about what circular economy means from a program point of view, and to accept that, embrace that, because and communicate that yes, it will have a longer program, and reflect that within your appraisals is the way that I would recommend having more success of it sticking and you're actually doing what you set out to do in the beginning.
Yeah, I think that's so true, Henry. So what we're hearing, I think here, everybody, is early engagement. And that's a constant theme, I think, that runs through this whole piece, because it perhaps requires a little bit more thought. And quite often buildings are left empty for a couple of years whilst planning permissions go through, and then people like John F. Hunt have, a very limited amount of time to then work their magic. And I think, Daniel, it's fair to say that the sooner you can be brought into that process, the better. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, I think, Henry, there's 2 points that you made there. One about program, and then that's for us to sort of give you as a collective client, certainty in that what you are asking is then what we can deliver, and if that comes with earlier access to say, this is how we would appraise the work, so we can give you a number to say that's going to potentially add 3 weeks to a program, cost you X, Y, and Z, and we're almost 100% sure that what you're paying is then going to achieve some level of outcome. Where there's sort of uncertainty and ambiguity in there, you hardly ever end up winning, because you're either pricing that in as risk as a contractor because you don't know if that's going to happen or not, and then you lose out as a client, because then everyone's sort of padding out their bids because there's that element of risk. On the early collaboration piece, that 50 Baker Street is an interesting project. We've had a few workshops with some of the contractors as part of the bid for that project. And it comes down to even using those slabs as void infill. Like we have a whole business that does concrete cutting essentially, and that we could share those learnings from the last 30 years in how we would approach it, and potentially how we would approach it is different to how the engineer on the construction side would approach it. So that void infill, I guess our solution would be, it's safer to lift out slabs vertically rather than as flat slabs, and that has actually, it sort of generated quite a high level detailed discussion to say, okay, maybe we look at what was in the tender pack slightly differently. But again, it's earlier to sort of close those questions out early enough so we can give you a set price and to say, this is exactly what we'll deliver.
Yeah, okay. And obviously that's crucial and based on, as you say, 30 years of experience. So I'm going to put, so I've got a bit of this question. I'm going to put it to you, Catherine, and then Debbie. So Catherine, do you think this is something we're seeing more of?
Yes, I think we're definitely seeing more of it. You know, I've got my business now as a reusefully of 9 people, and I wouldn't have
Yeah.
had that 5 years ago. So that's
What does
you know,
what does
that's
what does reusefully do in essence?
so we work with people like Henry and Daniel to some extent, and we go in and we work out what you can do with the buildings and what the materials in there in terms of reuse and high value recycling. So I think it's really useful to look at this question, I guess, from a sort of a material product perspective, because we know some products and materials are a lot more easier to reuse and they have a much more sort of defined reuse pathway, but some are really difficult. Also, you know, a lot of the buildings they're just quite low quality sometimes in the materials that are in there, so it's very hard to get value out of them at the end of the day. And I think that's really important as well if we look at future design, really, to look at what we're putting in and the value retained in those elements. And I think that comes to a bit more of that whole building as material banks and that residual value piece and how we account for our materials. As ASBP, we've been doing some work, as Debbie mentioned, on two products and materials that are harder to reuse, which is glass partitions, and we're just looking at fire doors as well. And I guess what we're trying to do as ASBP in that manner is just really trying to sort of work out how it can actually be done and the practicalities of that from A, identifying it, from B, to getting it all the way back into another building. There's lots of things that need to add up in that whole chain, you know, and understanding the testing and certification is also, you know, really, really important.
Yeah. All right. Thanks, Catherine. And then Debbie, the rebuild site really tends to rely on surplus construction materials, as I understand it, the ones that are perhaps over-ordered and surplus to requirements. So how many rebuild sites are there in the UK?
There's just the one up in Carlisle at the moment, and yeah, we had a pilot project in Wolverhampton that unfortunately is just finishing, but I think there's definitely appetite to have reuse hubs in various different cities, particularly a lot of appetite now in London, because it's, I think, oftentimes when you read reports about circular economy, it focuses on the economy and the environment, but there's very much a social value piece around circular economy as well. And I think with the community level reuse hubs, such as Rebuild, that is a really fundamental part of what we do around volunteers, around giving people access to, you know, local people access to cheaper materials. You know, we've also got a tool library, which very much complements the reuse hub, and also skills workshops. And I think looking at that as a bigger picture in terms of risk and resilience for the construction industry and our wider communities, I think the fact that more and more reuse hubs are being looked at alongside big developments, and, you know, what can happen with even just the surplus materials. I mean, this stuff hasn't even been used once. There's just so much waste still in the construction industry. It's a bit crazy, but I think, you know, they all dovetail one into the other, because if you've got the processes there, the infrastructure there to deal with the surplus, a similar infrastructure would also deal with materials that are coming out from deconstruction projects. And it's just part of that cultural shift, both as individuals and as businesses, to not have to have shiny and new. New to use should be fine. We've got so much material out there already. We need to get the processes in place to be able to use what we've already got.
Yeah, absolutely. So we need one of sort of a reuse hub, really, sort of every 50 miles or 35 miles.
Yeah,
I mean,
need an infrastructure of them all. Yeah,
I mean,
network.
I'm an idealist, but I mean, you know, if anybody from the government's listening, this is probably what we need. All right, well, let's move on. Thank you so much for your contributions to this question. Let's move on to the next question now. So we've got a few questions coming into from the audience, so we'll take those in a moment. So I don't want to be negative, but this question is looking at sort of the main barriers, I suppose. So I'm just going to ask perhaps one barrier from each of you, and then we'll move on, because this is quite a difficult thing to do anyway, and actually there are many barriers, but let's not focus on the negatives. So I'm going to start off with you, Debbie, and then I'll move to Catherine, and then Henry, and then Daniel. So Debbie, what do you see as being the main barrier, and how do we overcome it?
Outside the infrastructure piece that I've kind of just covered really as part of that logistics and storage, so I'm going to pinch another one and say insurance and warranties, which is something that the ASBP are looking at delving further into. The steel piece and the raised access flooring piece have got round that. As Catherine was saying, those are two, you know, products that are getting more into mainstream because they've solved that insurance and warranty piece to a degree. But it's really working with the wider industry, with the insurance companies, and finding out with manufacturers and finding out how we can solve that as a problem is quite key, I think, moving forward.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much. Catherine, you got anything to add there?
Lots of barriers, but I'll just focus on one, which is information, really. So we'll go into buildings. Rarely do we have any information on the building. I think Daniel probably agrees on this. We don't get a lot. Sometimes you don't get floor plans. Hardly you get O&M manuals. So the less you know about the product, the more risky it is then to reuse that product at the end of the day. And you have to make lots of different assumptions on that product in terms of potentially how old it is, who the manufacturer is, did it have a warranty, for etc., what the value of it is, etc. So and it's just really good practice to have good information for your buildings and the materials within it, not necessarily from a circular economy point of view. I think all of us, as you know, as building owners or those advising building owners, should have much more accessible and better information. Hopefully that will change with different regulations coming in, but I think we're not quite there yet for what we've already got.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Catherine. So yeah, and so Henry.
Well, yes, agree with all of the above. I guess the only thing I could add is potentially time. I mean, time has an impact, and obviously has an impact on our appraisal, as Daniel's described. I mean, and the certainty on program is often something that I think colleagues have struggled to deal with. And then I think generally, I think market perception has been an issue. I think that's changing for reuse. I mean, as long as these insurances and warranties are available. And then I think the last thing is creativity, is just having this open mind of looking at, taking the time, engaging early with colleagues, and looking at a variety of options to find creative ways of reusing. And I think then just looking at the future, it is sometimes again, it's an investment decision to create. So and I'll use our partners British Land as an example, where we've built a purpose-built lab for the Francis Crick Institute in an existing office building at 20 Triton. And it looks gorgeous. And there we've designed it in such a way so that it could be any size of lab in the future, or not any size, but it splits down to we've put in the services, so you can easily, just by putting a glass wall down, make it a smaller or a larger lab. And that is sort of thinking of this sort of long life, loose fit kind of idea. You might fit in a little bit more now, but it has a much longer life.
Yeah, wise words. Yeah, thank you. And Daniel, I'm sure you agree with everybody.
Yeah, Henry, you took my answer there. I think ultimately time, all of these issues just come down to time, because there is a solution for most issues, and we find that as the biggest barrier. And it's whether it's, I understand there's a reasoning for not always wanting early collaboration and keeping that competitive tension sort of down your supply chain to make sure you're getting the best value from that perspective. But when you are appointing a contractor quite late, and then there's a close start date, as soon as you do start on site, your program is pressed by soft strip, then it gets pressed by any demolition phases, and then next thing you know, there's a main contractor sort of breathing down your neck. So that window of opportunity for actually doing anything is already shortened. And if there's none of that early engagement to sort of get that information that Catherine was discussing and anything like that, again, you're shortening your window from the front end. So yeah, I think time gives you enough leverage then to sort of work through some of these problems.
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much for emphasising that. I think it's really important. So I've got a quick question that has come in from the audience. Do please keep your questions coming in. So I've got a question here from Chisholm. So I put this to Daniel because so the question is, for building designers, what advice would you give them for designing buildings for reuse? And I think the demolition and deconstruction industry are really key to informing designers of what works and what doesn't work. So I know I'm just going to throw this at you, Daniel, but I'm just wondering if you can come back on that one.
No, it's a good point, because the way we would look to reuse any work at the moment is that you would essentially just reverse the construction phase. But really, what is a key factor now is that our industry, in the demolition industry, has probably spent a large part of the best part of 25 years removing people from the work phase, exclusion zones and machinery and all of that stuff. Reuse is putting people back in there. So one of the key considerations is, if you are looking at, if you take example for a facade, some of the panels can be quite heavy and significant. So it's about, if you're putting people back into that space, are they too big to be lifted off with a mobile crane, or what is the capacity? Do you have the floor height then to get a small crane in to assist with that? Because then you're sort of looking in the realms of manual handling and all of that stuff. So ultimately, if there's a clear process for the construction, we could try and figure out a way for the reverse of that. But anything more specific, then feel free to invite us to your offices and we can discuss individual items in more detail. But essentially, I think safety is probably a key concern.
Yeah, okay. So really, as you're thinking about putting the building together, you should be thinking about how you take that building apart at the same time, really, which is quite a difficult sort of mindset change, I think, for most designers when all's said and done. So I'm sure there's a whole range of skills there that we perhaps need to look at. All right, so let's move on to our next question. So perhaps if we can advance the slide. So I'm probably most excited about this bit, because this is, I think, we all believe in sort of learning by doing. So I'd be ever so grateful if you could share some real world examples. I'm going to go in the reverse order to the one I did at the last question. So Daniel, I'm going to go to you first, and then Henry, and then Catherine, and then Debbie, just to so you know. So Daniel, perhaps you can talk about one or two case studies that you've been involved in and sort of challenges that you've overcome. That'd be lovely. Thank you.
Yeah, I think we've been working for GPE at 180 Piccadilly. I think the reuse strategy was set out as quite clear from the beginning. Elliott Wood were the engineers and parts or sustainability consultants on that project. So from day one, there was a clear message that this is what was required, and we had a clear schedule of items that were to be retained. In many of those cases, we could go above and beyond, because the removal of those items ended up being sort of easier than was expected. So additional benefit was sort of given back to the client. and the designers for that. So I think on that project, over 2,000 individual items were sent for reuse, but and a lot of that went through social value. So even down to toilets and plugs and lights and the small scale sort of furniture, fixtures and fittings. And then if we look at the complete opposite scale in terms of structural reuse, we've been working with British Land at Euston Tower and removed a concrete slab 4.5 meters by 1.5 meters, again to be reused back into that development for sort of like a block and beam slab. So again, part of their planning requirements to reduce their embodied carbon. So we've got two ends of the spectrum in terms of reuse, and one is very much performance spec for slab reuse. So you've got to make sure that it meets the safety and the that is required, and there's a lot more testing involved and logistics and regulations and warranties. And then on the other side, I think small scale reuse is changing every month, and there's a new person or third party in the mix that's going to take materials, or there's a materials exchange platform in there to support you. So I think that there's enough there to sort of to go on. I just go back to time. You just need the time to be able to do it.
Okay, that's a key message that's coming through. So we will be going on to sort of technology and the things that can help us in this process. So that's a question towards the end. So thanks for that then, Daniel. Henry, so over to you.
So beyond the raised access floor, which there's been a lot of, I think, so real examples, I've mentioned how Derwent London engaged with Spiro Happold early on to look at the slabs, and Daniel said that they've been involved in that. I think that was quite a creative way of dealing with something and still gives a bit of a product. Mentioned the clay at Tribeca. So I think I don't think we have the complete answer yet, but I think there's definitely a drive towards. I think these material banks that we've mentioned before will definitely help in forming our decisions and judgment on how we reuse, not just on site, but how we reuse across sites. I think is the key thing now. On 50 Baker Street, it's also small, but it is really quite important to be reusing all the cobbles from the little cobble street down Broadstone Place, which is, in the past, people would have just, thrown away, but they're actually lovely and they've got character, and it's going back into the Muse Street. So they're being lifted and nicely redone. I think Catherine's team has also worked with Derwent London on Holden House, where again, Derwent kept really good records of all the existing material in there and looked at how, if you take something out of Holden, or if you put something in there, how it could maybe be used in future on another building in the portfolio. Like let's say you take a switchboard out, can you use it as spares for like the T building or something like that. So I think we're seeing more and more real world examples. I think the other thing just to mention is that the best way that I have found is to very carefully and creatively look at space. So a good example of that is at the Francis Crick Institute, we reorganized some of our roof plants in order to create a space for MSD to build a purpose-built lab for MS, a 20,000 square foot purpose-built lab for MSD, double-story lab within a roof void. I think that kind of thing is to always try and find a creative way of using your space in the best possible way, even before you think about reusing the material.
Yeah, okay, thank you, Henry. All right, so Catherine, you've been involved in loads of projects. So perhaps you can share one or two with us.
I'm going to hark back to the past, actually, because a lot of this is, we used to do quite a lot of this, and there's case studies that hark back from quite a long time ago. One case study I'm not involved in because it's happened quite a long time ago is the Schiphol and the bus station there, and I love this case study. I think it's in its third or fourth life now, which just goes
Yeah.
to show you can do this. So it started off as a World War II hangar in England. It was then bought and used as a hangar at Schiphol Airport. I think then its third life, it was then turned into I think a hangar for the Ministry of Justice, so bits were taken off and put back together. And now in its current reincarnation, it is a bus shelter, quite a nice bus shelter, a big bus shelter in Schiphol Airport. So, I mean, that's, and it, that sort of frame structure helps with that reuse, but just goes to show, these buildings and the materials that we're working with can have such a long life. Another project that we've been working on is with LSE 35 Lincoln Inns Fields, not with JF Hunt, unfortunately, that one. But if that the client set quite a high reuse target there of 50%, but that did include some retained elements. And there's reuse, quite a lot of brickwork. They're also looking at crushing brickwork to turn it into sort of a dust for lime plaster type thing, and also terrazzo as well. I think the challenge is, though, when you're working on a live project and trying to reuse materials, is you don't, and if it's bricks and that sort of thing, you just don't quite know how many you're always going to get out in one piece, which are going to be suitable for the new elements of the construction. But that could be all different materials. Bricks is just an example there. So it's really on the designers to be as flexible as possible within their designs, and be able, I think Henry may mention sort of being open-minded and a bit more creative, because you are using sometimes a bit more of a limited supply if you're reclaiming from that existing building, or you may have to mix and match and that sort of thing. So that can be quite a challenge, as well as how you cost for all of this as well, but maybe we'll come into that in a minute.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Catherine. And Debbie?
I think again, going back into the past, I know a colleague of ours, Howard Button, very experienced in the demolition industry, always talks about the kind of big fields that used to have lots of bits of buildings in, and people used to go, families with kids, and go and get a wooden truss or bits and pieces. And the salvage sector has been doing architectural salvage for a very long time, and it is looking at those examples, albeit quite value driven, I guess, particularly with the architectural salvage, a particularly nice fireplace surround, or cornicing, or but it's not that we don't know how to reuse. We do know how to reuse. It's just putting more of a modern spin to it, I guess, and all of the process and procedures and warranties, as we've talked about, that go with that. But I think also slightly more unusual reuse would be the ARP British Land Scheme at Triton Square, where they reused the facade. And one of the ways they were able to facilitate that was they actually had a pop-up factory a few miles away from the redevelopment to enable that to happen. So it's not particularly easy to reuse facade, but that project showed the art of the possible. So I think that's a really good one to look at.
Yeah, thanks, Debbie. So just to say, we've got lots of case studies on our website of real life examples where products have been reused. So we've been focusing on reuse of constructional steel. So there are many case studies from large office buildings to single houses. So do feel free to have a look there. So yeah, brilliant. Thank you very much for that. I'm keeping one eye on the time, so we're up against it. So perhaps if we could move on to our next question. Okay, so what are the key considerations for companies wishing to incorporate materials reuse principles into their business model? So we've touched a little bit on this. Yeah, I'm going to go round the other way and start with Debbie and then move down. So is there any one thing, do you think, that businesses need to be aware of to sort of make this happen more?
I think it is cultural shift, quite fundamentally, because I think we'd all be in agreement that most of this is actually technically feasible. It's just not quite financially sound in a lot of instances at the moment. So it's trying to do more and more of it so that it becomes more business as usual. So the skills to do it are there, and people view it as less risky because it's already been done before. So yeah, I think just in ensuring it's embedded in your organisation, people understand it. It's the education and awareness piece, I think, for me.
Okay, yeah, I think that's really valuable. Thanks, Debbie. So, Catherine.
I think for me, it's understanding that the value and the carbon piece. I don't think we're very good at costing for a lot of this reuse. Okay, so it may cost a little bit more to take it out, but then there may be massive savings if you're reusing it, because you're not buying new new for carpet, for example. And then what's the carbon story on top of that as well in terms of the reuse? It's a difficult one with the demolition contractor, because they don't get the carbon benefit, but the new project will get the carbon benefit. And then if we start pricing for carbon appropriately as well, then you know you're in quite a winning situation there. So I guess the projects we work on, we see wildly different calculations for reuse. And I think that's because sometimes it comes back to Debbie, and people just maybe don't want to do it culturally, so they're just pricing it really, really high, or they don't know how much they're just putting loads of risk in because they don't know how long it's going to take, etc., etc. But having a lot more benchmark data for cost, I think, would be really, really helpful.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Yeah, so I think the main driver really is to try and convince this government that we need legislation around embodied carbon. So this is something that we do at ASBP, this advocacy piece. So we would all urge everybody who's on the call here today to sign up to Part Z. So Part Z is our sort of campaign to support legislation for embodied carbon. And the government have made it very clear that they need bulk people to sign up to this to show that the industry is ready for such a change. So that would be my my thing. Henry, I'm going to move on to you.
So yeah, I agree with all of the above. Again, I think the thing that from a client developer kind of side is having very clear embodied carbon targets that we communicate to the team. I think if it comes from the developer client, it really enforces the message to the team, and everybody then can get on board and find creative ways. It's not easy, and often our consultants would come back to us and say, well, if you want that target, you have to compromise on X, Y, Z. And we sort of want our cake and eat it and say, no, we don't want to compromise on that. But that is helpful because it's an iterative process, and there is a point where you say, okay, we have now, we're not letting go of our targets, but we want you to find another way. And I think that really helps with that creativity. I mean, we've got amazing teams around us here in the UK, and I think some of them mentioned already. I think Arab's doing a fantastic job on the Marble Arch project with Fred Pilbro on looking at creative ways, for instance, and coming up with amazing product at the same time. So I think as a client, again, setting out those clear targets when we do our briefing on what it is that we want to achieve on the site is really important.
Yeah, okay, thank you. And so, Daniel.
Yeah, I think the question's in like two sections there. If you want to incorporate material reuse, it just becomes like almost a procurement exercise, and just picking the supply chain that has the materials available. Ultimately, that creates a demand for us to push materials back into the supply as well, so that it kind of feeds off itself. And then if we look at the deconstruction side of it, we found now this year's been, it's difficult for the industry in London, I think, with market forces or interest rates and all of that stuff, where people were quite happy to spend money, say, on the nice to do things. Now they come under a lot more scrutiny, and ultimately the bill gets fed all the way back up to the client. So it goes, you have to pick out what the value is in doing that exercise. So when we talk about value, sometimes there's inherent value in the material. So whether it's steel or raised access flooring, it gives the whole industry some leeway to either create a third party remanufacture route or a reuse route separately. Where there isn't an inherent value there yet, it might be an artificial value that has come from either a planning requirement or a funding requirement, or whether it's a great selling piece / ability to market your building and charge a rent premium or something like that. So it's quite important to understand where the value comes from. And I think it was Debbie or Catherine had said about, it wouldn't be us necessarily getting the carbon benefit, or even the client where the material is coming out of. It would be the recipient of those materials are getting the benefit, but it would be the client on your current project who's paying for that privilege. So I just think it's important to have those open and honest conversations and say, these are the value drivers on the project, and what ones are we willing to sort of negotiate on. And ultimately that is where we see what pushes what we end up doing on a project.
Yeah, okay.
Just add to that. Just add to that is on. I think it's also a bit of an education piece for us on our occupiers of buildings. So our tenants, often occupiers would have a stronger focus on operational carbon, and less so on embodied carbon, which obviously doesn't necessarily help the circular economy discussion. So I think that there is also this part of refocusing our clients, our occupiers, on being educated, being knowing about both things, where the buildings come from before the buildings in operation.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, that's crucial, isn't it? Okay, so I've got a question that's coming from Tony. So he talks about some timber formwork that was surplus to requirements, was left to the public to take, but the timber merchants ganged up on them and stopped the contractor from doing it. So there's this sort of threat to supply chains. They want you to buy new product from them. And I think that's a reasonable process. I mean, when we started looking at reuse of constructional steel, we got a letter from British Steel telling us basically to cease and desist, with a fairly hefty legal letter. So I think the industry is starting to understand that the circular economy and reuse is crucial, but there's still a reluctance. So I don't know, Catherine or Debbie, have you got anything to add to that? Do you think that say brick manufacturers are wary of the circular economy?
I think there's more manufacturers looking at it, and we are seeing that. I think though there is such a vested interest in selling new for lots and lots of manufacturers, and developing those business models to sell more reclaimed materials is quite a big ask for some, especially if their process is if they've invested a lot in manufacturing new. But I think it will change. I think quite a lot's going to come from Europe, just in terms of having product passports which will require information on circularity and reuse and that sort of thing. So I think it may be sort of more soft type legislation, but I think that will start to happen. And I just you know, when we work with manufacturers, we just ring them up and ask if they got a take back scheme or a reuse scheme. So I think the more people that do that, the better, because the more people that ask them, they'll probably think, oh, I'm going to have to start doing something here. So please all do that to your supply chain.
Yeah, okay, we'd welcome that. Thank you if you would do that. And I've got a question here about the Environmental Agency, which Catherine, I'll probably put to you. So this general suggestion is that if a building is being demolished, then everything in the building is then classified as waste and then falls under the duty of care regulations. So I don't know if you've got anything that you might sort of shed a little bit of light on there.
Yeah, it's the waste if you're disposing of it, and if you've always intended to already dispose of it as a waste. So if you're reusing it, it is not a waste, basically.
Right.
So so you don't fall under the whole waste regulations at that point. There's a whole load of also sort of end of waste criteria protocol for aggregates and steel, etc., etc. But Debbie, and I'm sure Daniel will totally agree with me that reuse is not waste.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. That's really useful. I've got another couple of questions that's come in from Bethany. I suppose the questions are really, so maybe I'll put this to Henry. So property folk like surveyors, how can they help advance circularity in the built environment? And I suppose we've covered most of the things really, but what I found particularly interesting was that we're starting to see that you have to do circular economy statements when you're doing planning permissions. And so Westminster have now refused a couple of applications on the basis of poor circular economy statements. So where it was a tick box exercise, I think the circular economy statement within a new development is actually going to be a really useful tool. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we went through quite a lot with Westminster when I was in London on 30 Baker Street, where we really worked hard to understand what redevelopment looks like, and a lot of studies on carbon and circular economy. So it's a very strong focus there. I just think it's on the agenda now. It is, and that's good, and we're raising awareness of it. I'd say the question of how would we deal with surveyors? Of course, you know, at the front end of the building, if you're purchasing a building, I think the surveyors gets it that you know, in order to get through planning, you're going to have to have a circular economy statement, and I think that sort of focuses the mind, because without that, you know, if it's a subject planning deal, the transaction is not going to get through unless you have a good circular economy story. I think at the tail end, we need to look at leasing and leasing surveyors as well, and how we talk not just about the operational carbon, but as I said before, you know, introduce the notion of a building with more circular economy could be a better story and a better thing for the occupiers, and which isn't really, I don't think is reflected that strongly just yet. And I think that is something that we could work on together as an industry.
Yeah, okay, I think it's really useful. And then sort of, you know, this concept of buildings as materials banks. So at the end of life, buildings have asset value, whereas at the moment, they generally sort of tend to be negative values. But at the end of the day, there's a whole load of materials in there that have value. So I think this might sort of rephrase and reframe that discussion. All right, I'm just mindful of time, so we're up against it. So I'm going to move through to the final question, if we may. And we're going to have a look at sort of what tools and what technologies and sort of processes and things like material index and materials passports that you know, might be able to help us in this process, might help us move us along. So I'm going to ask Catherine to lead on this one. So data sharing, digital tools, AI. Yeah.
Yeah, I think this sector's moving fast, isn't it? Not necessarily just for circularity, for whole realm of reasons. And I think it's just putting that lens for circularity onto it. So obviously lots of different building scanning tools now. You know, you can hopefully survey buildings a lot quicker these days, work out what's in them. Also the whole object recognition type piece, and just sort of making all that a lot easier. I think as well, material passports is moving faster in Europe because there is a requirement now for them as part of construction product regulation. I think that would be interesting to see how that whole material passport type commercial system pans out here. I think we will probably follow the European Union in that way, so we've got access to the market. BIM's an interesting one. I think it's great, and I think BIM, we don't really see that many models which have got a lot of detail on, which go down to the material level, which therefore then help for reuse at the end of the day. So I think they can be a bit limited and dependent on how big the BIM model is. But I think a lot of this is you've got to get the FM buy-in for me. So I think a lot of these tools and processes need to be integrated into that whole asset management piece to keep that information alive. And hopefully that's where sort of the surveyors of the world can also sort of add to it through their condition surveys and valuation surveys and maintenance. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's great. So I'm going to come to each one of you and see if there's a particular bit of software or a particular tool that's taken your fancy that you've looked at and thought this is brilliant. This is going to really move that ahead. Debbie, so is there anything that comes to mind?
I think the digital passports or materials passports piece is really crucial. Whether it it comes with the product as soon as it's made, or whether it's created as it's being deconstructed out of a building. I think also just using that as well in terms of extended producer responsibilities, another piece of regulation that's going to come through that will very much impact on the manufacturers, and potentially whether they will then do more take back, whether they will be looking at diversifying and pivoting their business models, because all of a sudden they're now responsible for what happens to their products at end of life. I think that will drive it a lot as well. And that data thread that's come out of the Building Safety Act, we need that green thread sitting alongside the golden thread, and you're going to need your materials passports, digital passports to be able to do that.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. All right, so I'm going to put it to you, Henry, and then Daniel. So, Henry.
There's no specific tool that I can mention, but I think generally it's a principle of getting, as Debbie said, a materials passport. I think is the key. We've mentioned before insurances and warranties. It's interesting. I met with one of the representatives of Dornbracht recently on something as simple as taps. I mean, it's really great quality taps. They now have a program where they take their taps back, take them out, you send them back to them, and they refurbish those taps with new cartridges and send them back. So, look, these are small steps, but I think they're all important in getting. And the thing is, it's not necessarily cheaper, and this is where the difficulty is with looking at a building as a bank of material and assets, because it's responsible. It's not necessarily cheaper, but we talked about time and resources. I think as it becomes business as usual, it might become more of an asset than a material bank asset than what it is, I think, at the moment. But it is certainly the way we should be going forward.
Yeah, I think that's really encouraging. Thanks. And Daniel.
Just quickly, I think outside of the material exchange platforms, the ones that are more proactive anyway, I would generally say Matterport has proved quite useful over the past year or so. We use it to sort of scan the buildings, and then they will become like a supplement to the asset list of products that are there, and then you can use that to send to multiple people at once. They can then tag items that they wish to sort of take or reuse or whichever, and then all of that, you're just releasing the burden on the site team of doing continuous site walks, hundreds of emails a week, just, requesting items or asking for the quality condition of X, Y, and Z. It's sort of all there, and that can be done sort of at any point in time as well.
Brilliant. That sounds like a really useful tool. All right, everybody. So thank you very much. It's been a pretty full-on and intense hour. So I'd really like to thank you for your input and your expertise that's sort of shone through. So thanks once again to MRICS for hosting and co-hosting with us on this webinar. So it is recorded. We will be doing a write-up, so we will let you have those as soon as they're ready. And I'd just like to say many thanks to our esteemed panel, and we'll say good afternoon to you, and wish you well, and look forward to seeing you at our next event. So thanks again. Thanks for joining us.